Hey guys, what's up? It's Alec Torelli. Welcome back to a hand of the day from the Triton High Roller $1 Million Buy-In, biggest tournament in history, coming up between Chidwick, Bryn, Kenney, and Sam Tricket on the hand of the day.
Hand of the day.
Before we jump into it, Conscious Poker is the best place to take your poker game to the next level, with new strategy videos coming out every week where we review high-stakes hands that either I play or the biggest hands from around the world in tournaments and cash games, and the chance to ask me anything on the Ask Alec show. It's a great place to improve at poker, and be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. For now, though, let's jump right in. The blinds are 3,000, 6,000 with a 6,000 ante. And unfortunately, we don't have all the pre-flop action on video, so we threw it in the replayer here for you guys, and I'll walk you through that quickly. Folding around to Chidwick in the hijack with the Jack-8 of clubs. Opts to make a min raise here to 12,000. Now, typically in this spot, I think this hand, like, if you look at a pre-flop chart or something fancy like that, it's probably going to be a fold, but with a big blind ante, you could open a little bit wider, and depending on who's on your left, I might make a game time decision to open a marginal hand like this one. I could get behind it, I could get behind a fold as well. Just sort of depends on the table, your image, etc. Won't bore you with the whole thing. 12,000 is a fine raise size. Going min allows you to raise more hands, etc. Over to Trickett in the small blind now, who I think ace-jack offsuit probably has a 3-bet, especially facing a min raise here. I think offsuit hands, you're probably going to 3-bet a little bit more. Ace-jack, I think, plays a little bit better, denying equity from the big blind and just playing this hand aggressively with the lead. You give yourself sort of two chances to win the hand by either, folding, everyone folding pre-flop and you winning the pot, or, you c-bet with the advantage post-flop. So I think I like this play a little bit as a 3-bet more. I'd probably go pretty big here too, especially against a good player like Chidwick. I don't want to make it too easy for him to just call me pre-flop with whatever. So I make a big 3-bet size here with a strong hand like this one. As played, a call is fine as well. You're still profiting by calling. I just think 3-bet's a little bit better. Anyway, calling is fine. Maybe you want a lower variance day one of a high-stakes tournament as well. Calling makes sense in that regard. And over to Kenney in the big blind. 8-6 off, obviously not a good hand, but when you're only calling 6,000 into like 40, you're just getting too good of a price. You have to call with these trash sort of offsuit hands just based on your odds alone. Maybe get in there, flop something big, win a big pot. So you're playing your direct odds. You got to call very, very wide here. 8-6 off is fine. We call. Let's take a flop. Flop comes down 7-4-3 all clubs. Everybody gets a little piece. Obviously, Trickett with a nut flush draw, 2 overs. Kenney with a gut shot and a flush draw, and Chidwick flopping the flush. Trickett checks, pretty standard. Kenney checks, pretty standard as well. I think checking to the button is pretty standard. I think you can make a case for Kenney leading here on this board, even though if you look at some GTO strategy on these monotone boards, typically people are checking a lot to the original raiser. Nobody really has a strong range advantage. But it's pretty surprising here that Chidwick checks on the button. I think as the pre-flop raiser, flopping a big hand, you typically see people bet in these spots. That said, I'd like to explore the logic of him checking, which I think makes a lot of sense. If you do check here, if you're faced against aggressive opponents like Trickett and Kenney, who are likely to bet the turn with a high frequency, it does make some sense to check back here on the flop and be able to defend against that. You also make your range look a lot weaker than it is. Remember something simple that is probably not overstated enough. If you win money at poker by making your opponents think you have the opposite of what you do. So when you bet a flop like this, it looks like you got a big piece of it, right? You're probably not betting with Jack-10 of diamonds. So when you bet 7-4-3 all clubs, you probably have a big pair or a big club, or maybe a flush already. So checking makes it look like you have air, and that's a chance for your opponents to falsely think you have nothing and then maybe bluff or overvalue their hands. So I like this play by Chidwick. The one thing I would say is your hand is still a little bit vulnerable. It does benefit from protection, so maybe check with the nut flush is a little bit better. But you don't always have the friggin' nut flush. You can't just wait for the perfect situation to check. So throwing this hand in your checking range makes a lot of sense. Turn comes down a jack of spades. And I think here Trickett could opt for a bet, top pair, top kicker. He can get value from his hand. He could deny some equity. And he has the nut flush draw to go with it. So I think here betting the turn, and then if you get called, betting the river and just trying to get 2 streets of value from a jack. I wouldn't advocate that line if you had a worse jack, like Jack-10, even if you had a club, just because you don't get value from another jack. But with ace-jack, you could get value from a hand like King Jack or Queen Jack or Jack 10. You could also get value from Kenney in the big blind, who can easily have like 9-7 offsuit with a club and get, one, maybe two streets of value from that hand as well. So I kind of like a bet here from Trickett in this spot. As played, though, he checks. Now over to Bryn Kenney with a super disciplined check here on the turn. I think here you can make a strong case for betting. You have a hand with no showdown value, and you have a hand with blockers. You block a straight, you block a flush, and you have equity when called. Even if you get called by Jack 10, you could still win with potentially 9 outs or 12 outs. So I think in this spot, I would probably opt for a bet here. I'd like a feeler bet here, like half pot, and just get some middling hands to fold, some hands with equity to fold, some overcards to fold. I think here he has the range advantage. He definitely has a hand that's potentially the strongest. He could have connected with this low board, flopped a straight or some weird 2-pair. So I actually like a bet here from Bryn. Quite surprised that the check, especially from an aggressive player like him, showed a lot of discipline. Over to Chidwick now, who I think has a slam dunk bet. I mean, you could definitely argue for a bet on the flop, could argue for a check, could get behind that. But on the turn, you got to bet here, right? It gets checked all around twice. I think here going for a bet makes a lot of sense. And it really depends on your strategy for the sizing. Do you want to bet small and maybe induce a raise and make your hand look really weak? Or do you want to bet really big and just throw your opponents for a loop and be like, why did he check the flop and now he's potting the turn? So it kind of depends on where you're at, what your strategy is, what you think your opponents are doing. I think you can really make a case for both here, but the point is you definitely got to put something out here on the turn. 15 to 45,000, all those make sense. You can make a case for all of them. But I'm really surprised here to see Chidwick check again. I guess he's hoping that like someone just bets the river and he could raise and then they're super confused. But I think that line looks almost so weird that it would just feel like he definitely has it because nobody would bluff with that line. If they were bluffing, they would have bet the flop or the turn. So I feel like it's just sort of a weird line to take. I'd like to see a bet here on the turn. You're even happy to get check raised because your opponents can easily think that you're just bluffing because you checked the flop. Anyway, I definitely favor a bet on the turn, but he checks. Now let's take a river. River comes as 7 of spades, and here I think Trickett has a very clear bet. Gets checked around twice, your hand is very likely good, and I like his decision to go a third of the pot here. You want to bet small here, especially on this paired board. Someone could still maybe have a 7, but you're really just hoping to get called by maybe some weird like ace-4 that just checked all the way down, or just a worse jack, and I think a small size is pretty good. Maybe you even get looked up by some ace-high some of the time. So I like this bet size by him. And over to Bryn Kenney now, who does opt to go for a raise here. And I like his decision to go 102,000. If you're going to raise this spot, you have to think about what hands you're repping. When you raise this river, you're repping trip 7s, a straight, or a flush. Right? So you're repping a very narrow value range. Your hand is your range is very narrow, and you're going to want to raise big with those types of hands to get value. You're also going to want to raise big with your bluffs because you're not going to want to make it easy for your opponent to call. So a big raise when you're repping few hands makes a lot of sense. I like his hand to do it. He, again, does have all the blockers we talked about on the turn, so I think this makes a lot of sense. There's not that many 7s that Trickett's going to have here. Some of those 7s are going to bet the turn. He doesn't call with that many 7s pre-flop. And, he probably would have bet stronger hands than that in a previous point in the hand. So I think a raise here makes a lot of sense. Over to Chidwick now, who I think has a pretty clear call. It's kind of a weird spot for him because when he calls this river, he never really has a boat. So his range is always capped. We'll get to that in a little bit. But, he's basically hoping that Trickett's betting all sorts of hands on the river, either for value or his bluffs, that Kenney is bluffing, or he even beats some of the value range that Kenney is raising with, right? So anytime you beat your opponent's bluffs and you beat their value hands, you always have to call, right? So even if Kenney had him beat here, this would be a definite clear call. He can beat a 7, he can beat a straight, he can beat some smaller flushes, he beats bluffs. So very clear call here from Chidwick. Can't really do much else. Now over to Trickett, who clearly never has the best hand, right? Ace-Jack is definitely not good in this spot, hardly ever. So he has a very, very clear fold.
Work at this point, but, I mean, it would look pretty ridiculous. I don't know. The board's paired.
Well, you can see the body language. Doesn't seem like...
Wow!
I was going to say, it didn't seem like he's going to shove all
This
in
is insane hand. Bryn, the sick part is Bryn was right that Sam was weak.
Oh my gosh, what a shove by Trickett here. Let's talk about this and what he's up to. Well, first you want to think about what types of hands Trickett has in his hand, right? So he has a jack in his hand which makes it less likely people have jacks. And he has an ace of clubs in his hand, which means it's impossible for people to have the nut flush. So he does have some great blockers here, right? So he knows that like people are up to something. He doesn't really know exactly what everyone has necessarily. Maybe he thinks Kenney's on a bluff and Chidwick has a 7, or Kenney's on a bluff, or Kenney has a straight and Chidwick has a flush. But he knows nobody has jacks full, and he knows nobody has the nut flush. So if you are trying to construct a range here for a bluff, right? You're trying to figure out what hands am I 3-bet bluff shoving the river with, right? Say that 3 times in a row. This is the perfect bluff to do it from that point of view. Now let's also take a look at his opponent's ranges and see if this is a good spot to bluff exploitatively. Well, Kenney could definitely have it, right? So he definitely has to worry about Kenney in the big blind. And honestly, it might sound weird, but Kenney's range is more troublesome to him than Chidwick's range. Kenney could definitely have 3s, he can have 4s, he can have like even a 7-4, he can have a jack-7. Some of those hands would bet the turn, so maybe he can't have all the combos of those hands, but Kenney could definitely have a boat, and if he does, Trickett is fucked. Kenney's going to call, and Trickett's going to be out of this tournament. But Kenney's an aggressive player, he could be bluffing, and he could be value raising a lot of hands that will fold here on this spot. Kenney, obviously with the 8 high, has a very clear fold, he gets out of the way. And now over to Chidwick. Let's look at the types of hands Chidwick could have. I think here in this spot, he basically doesn't have a range of hands that loves getting shoved on here, right? He never really has a boat because all of his sets or 2 pairs would have bet the flop or the turn. So his range here is pretty much what's called capped, meaning there's a ceiling on the strength of the hand that he could have, and that's limited to flushes, which I don't even know if Trickett puts him on a flush because he checked twice, or most likely a hand like a strong 7, which he can definitely have something like ace-7 suited, or maybe even a 7-8 type of hand that checked it all the way down. But those are the most likely hands he has, and when he's facing a 3-bet here from Trickett, his range is never ahead of Trickett unless Trickett is bluffing. And since nobody bluffs in this spot, he might fold here a large percentage of the time, thereby making this a great bluff from Trickett. I actually was in a spot almost identical to this in about 10 years ago in a high-stakes cash game at the Bellagio, and based on how the hand was played, the board was like king, 9, 4, 3 with a flush out there. I bet the river with a king for value. The big blind called, the button raised. I knew his range was capped based on how the hand he was played. I thought he had a small boat or a flush. I jammed it in. He ended up, everyone folded, and the play got through. Just because the frequency to which you're not shown the nuts here is like 0. You're always shown the nuts here in this spot, right? Which makes this play a great bluff. When you add that up to the fact that your opponents are likely going to fold a very high percentage of the time, they're not going to hero call you here, I actually love this play. So I could see why Chidwick in this spot is just going to always put Trickett on the nuts. It's like a spot where nobody ever bluffs. And so I think from Chidwick's point of view, I'm probably just going to pitch this hand. All right, we're going to go a little bit next level here, and I'm going to share the one qualm I sort of have with this shove, and that is, if you're Chidwick looking at Trickett's range, what hands is he representing? Like, what hands does Trickett bet this river with and then shove facing this action? Well, sure, he could have pocket 7s for quads, but there's only one combination of that, and typically you don't want to bluff when you're only repping one combo of value. What other hands can he shove with? Well, maybe you say he can have 5-6 suited, but I would really challenge that. Is he really going to call out of position preflop from the small blind facing an open from a great player with 5-6? Probably not. He could have jacks, sure, but remember, Chidwick has a jack, which blocks jacks, so there's only one combination of jacks left, but preflop, Trickett didn't 3-bet, he just flat called. So I'm using what's called a hand range funnel, which is a process I've developed to figure out exactly what my opponents are holding using step-by-step system, starting with preflop and going through the hand. I've made this available to you absolutely free at Conscious Poker at the link below, so download that if you want to get better at hand reading. But for now though, let's look at other types of hands Trickett can have. Sure, he maybe has pocket 4s or pocket 3s, but it's hard for him to have those hands. Maybe he would have bet the flop, maybe he would have bet the turn, maybe he would have bet bigger on the river. And even if he played those hands this way up until this point, would he really shove the river facing this action? Sure, he might think he has the best hand, but he also might think, look, it's for my tournament life, and I'm only going to really get called if I'm beat. So a lot of those hands won't shove, meaning the only types of value hands he's shoving are one or two or few combos. So I could see why, from Chidwick's point of view, he's really debating this situation. Let's take a look and see what happens.
Would he only do this with a boat because the board is paired? It's quite scary. He knows, Chidwick knows his hand looks very under-repped because he checked back the flop, he checked back the turn. Most certainly, if Chidwick had a set, he would have bet already. And he does lay it down.
Wow.
Oh my
Samuel
God.
Tricket.
Definitely can't blame Chidwick for folding here. I don't think he's getting the right price to call long term. People are just not bluffing here often enough to call. Even though we could see the cards, I still think this is a fold. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts in a comment below. Obviously, a crazy sick hand, one of those all-time bluffs that will go down in history. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. Awesome content is coming from the Triton High Roller series and much more poker around the world. Thanks for watching Conscious Poker.